Hello, welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to take a look at a recent publication from the Deutsches Aktieninstitut. It's the German Equities Institute. And this paper is based on data up until July of this year, so July 2024. And the paper is looking at the results of a study or a survey into ESRS practice, so covering double materiality and some organizational aspects of preparing for reporting. Now, the sample group, as far as I can tell, is members of the Institute, and that means the data set is going to be leaning towards larger listed companies. I can't find an exact statement of whether or not any smaller non-listed companies are involved in the data. So I can't be absolutely sure, but I suspect this data leans towards the larger entities. So bear that in mind when we are looking through the results. I want to look at 5 sort of highlight items and then 2, let's call them oddities that we can discuss as well in this paper. Here is the paper then. I'll provide a link to this in the description. Here is the title if you want to search for it yourself. And I'm going to skip to the content so we can look at the layout before we get into my review of the paper's content. The paper has a executive summary, as you would expect, of the sort of high-level findings. We're going to skip that completely in this video. The first section focuses on double materiality, and it's broken down into 4 broad steps. You can see those here: understanding context, identifying IROs, assessment of IROs, which they're calling evaluation and determination, and then validation of the assessment by stakeholders. The next section of the report is scoping of the sustainability report itself, or the sustainability statement. And here we go beyond simply setting the scope based on the topics, but we go into a bit more information about relevance of data points. There is a section looking at definitions of terms, which isn't particularly interesting in the context of this video, and a section at the end on internal control systems, which we will also not need to talk too much about. So let's go into the 5 highlights that I've found in this paper. So the first highlight, fortunately, is graphical, so it is quite interesting on a video. And here we see the breakdown in the approaches that are being used to determine or to identify IROs. So there are 2 broad approaches. There is the top-down, that is where a centralized expert group within the organization meets or communicates and tries to identify what it thinks the IROs are. A bottom-up methodology is where you delegate the responsibility down to operational or, in quotes, subordinate levels of the organization, and then you filter that information to the centralized sort of project team, and then you obviously have to try and filter and reduce duplicates, etc., to come to a final list of IROs. Nobody is doing the bottom-up method alone. So nobody has completely delegated this process. That makes complete sense to me. Top-down is still being conducted, or is being conducted, by nearly half of the organizations that responded to the survey, and then the remainder are doing a mixed approach, top-down and bottom-up, which is also what I would expect. I'm not sure what other includes. Perhaps other might mean some kind of AI-based approach or some random selection of IROs. I have no idea. It seems to me you've really got, methodologically speaking, these 2 options to choose from. And it's good to see that top-down and mixed approaches are dominating. Bottom-up, I think, would just be too difficult to organize, and it would create huge amounts of redundancies, and the kind of filtering and sorting process could go on forever. So that's my first highlight, is this kind of interesting breakdown here of how companies are going about their identification process. Second highlight is the spread of IROs in pure numerical terms, or let's say the total number of IROs, which is actually what we're seeing here. Now, these are the numbers of IROs which were identified. So this is pre-assessment. This is not the number of material IROs. But what we see here is a big spike at this sort of 200 to 300 IRO range. Now, I suspect this is giving us more evidence that what we have here is a data set which is largely listed companies who are trading their equities in some way. This is the kind of number of IROs I expect to see for large, potentially multidisciplinary and certainly multi-geographic companies. Above 400 IROs, I can imagine how difficult it must be to try and juggle and manage that many IROs. There are around 105 to 110, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, sustainability matters. This indicates that there are 4 per matter. That is a large number of IROs to have to deal with. And it indicates to me that perhaps nothing has been sort of screened out based on existing reporting and existing management processes. They've tried to come up with one for everything. At the closer to the bottom end of the scale, we see this 50 to 100 range. Now, a lot of the companies I'm talking with and helping through this process are in the SME kind of bracket. And this is the number I'm seeing from most SME companies that I'm talking to, this 50 to 100 IROs being identified. And as you can see, then some companies are reporting fewer than 50, but that tends to be the smaller proportion of companies surveyed. My advice to use this then is not that you should be targeting a specific number of IROs, but one of the questions that we see time and time again for first-time reporters, of which almost everybody is when it comes to the ESRS, people just don't know what looks reasonable. So having this kind of information to hand helps people understand whether they're kind of in the middle of the pack. And I think a lot of reporting companies just want to be in the middle of the pack right now. They want to just be in the middle. They don't want to be an outlier, because it seems that the outliers are the ones who are, let's say, taking some of the heat and being criticized, and the ones that are just in the middle are slipping past without getting too much attention paid to them. So that's my second highlight of this, some quantification of how many IROs companies are identifying. The next highlight is the standards that were found to be material. So you can see the graph at the top of this page. There are 2 graphs on this page, and I want to mention them both. The one at the top indicates the proportion of reporting companies for whom these topics were material. And you can see here that climate change and own workforce have been found to be material 100% of the time. Now, this is really good news. This is good news for one reason, because the topic climate change was intended originally to be the only mandatory topic, and that was watered down somewhat. However, in practice, it's turning out that everybody so far is reporting it as material, which is really good news. And it's also good to see that own workforce is being reported as material. I remember some of the conversations when the ESRS was first released in its final form. There was some concern from certain commentators that the materiality process would allow far too much leverage and far too much leeway for companies to scope out these topics. And climate change and own workforce were the ones that were being talked about quite a bit. Well, it turns out that actually they're all being scoped in, which gives me a little bit more confidence in the materiality process, and it certainly kind of bats away some of those criticisms, I think. The graph down below, which standards were completely omitted during the materiality assessment. Now, I'm not quite sure if I'm reading this correctly based on that title, because the text above it just says the standards shown in figure 9 were not identified as material. I'm actually inclined to think that the sentence above the graph is not explaining what the graph is explaining. I actually think the graph is saying that the topic was actually omitted during the assessment. That is, no IROs were identified for that topic. That makes more sense because the 2 charts then the data in these 2 charts actually makes logical sense together. If the bottom graph is the number of companies who found the topic to be not material, but they did have IROs in the assessment, then the 2 graphs don't add up. So I think what we're seeing in this bottom graph is that no IROs for that topic was considered at all during the assessment, which is interesting to see such a high proportion with affected communities and pollution, not a single IRO. Now, affected communities, I can kind of understand if your value chain definition is very, very narrow. But if your value chain definition goes more than 1 tier up or down the value chain, it's very hard to imagine that there is no part of that kind of value chain that doesn't have an affected community to consider, even if it's in the aggregate. And the same with pollution. If these are the larger businesses, which the previous graphs indicate, then I think these results are a little bit disappointing. But it's also possible that this is largely due to very, very narrow, short value chains being defined in the first reporting year. And as companies get more familiar with this process, they will expand their value chain definitions, and they will include some more of those topics in their assessment process. On to the next highlight here. So this is a graph showing the functions within a company that have been used to put technical expertise into the materiality assessment. Now, I would not consider this stakeholder consultation in any way. So this is people who are helping the organization identify and assess the IROs, but they are not acting as stakeholders. They are acting as part of the organization itself. But if you are planning a materiality project and you're unsure about who in the organization should be involved, this is a nice way of getting a fairly early heads up about how broad and how wide across the organization the involvement might be. The final highlight of this paper I want to draw your attention to is some best practice tips here with regards to stakeholder engagement. And in particular, the opening phrase here where it says the use of existing processes and the analysis of proxies is a suitable way to include the perspective of affected stakeholders. So existing processes are things like your annual general meeting and existing employee satisfaction surveys. For example, if you've conducted a survey of your employees and you find out certain things about the working conditions that they are unhappy about, that indicates to you that you have an affected stakeholder that is affected under the working conditions subtopic or one of the subtopics. So you can use your existing internal processes from those various different technical departments to inform the identification and assessment of IROs. Another proxy then we come on to the topic of proxies. So we have here mention of the scientific reports which relate to an environmental standard. It could be a proxy for nature as the silent stakeholder. That's mentioned directly in the standard itself, and that is something we shouldn't ignore during the double materiality process. We can consult published scientific papers to understand impacts. Kind of sounds obvious when we say it, but it can get lost sometimes in the process. And the other types of proxies that exist would be representatives of stakeholder groups. Now, I can think of a couple very quickly, and that would be a workers' council, for example, for your own workforce, or a union, or unions, in fact, for the value chain as well. The unions who represent your key value chain partners, or the workers of your key value chain partners, could also be considered to be proxies for those stakeholder groups, should you identify IROs that relate to the workers in your value chain. So we don't always have to go out and survey every single person or every single member of a stakeholder group if we can find the appropriate proxy to engage on their behalf. Noting then at the bottom here, a one-size-fits-all approach to stakeholder surveys will usually not be useful. And I've mentioned that in a number of forums that I don't like this idea of just having a stakeholder survey that you can send out to everybody and get useful information. Engagement should be tailored to the IROs, in my opinion, and to the specific interests of the stakeholders. Now I'm going to just mention one or two of the sort of questions or perhaps quibbles I have about this paper. And the first one here is in the practical tips for engagement. The opening part of this paragraph, I think, is entirely reasonable, that external stakeholders often find the number and variety of topics challenging. Now here I'm assuming this is a reference to topics, subtopics, and sub-subtopics. Now there are more than 100 of these, and simply sending a list of all of them to a stakeholder saying something like, tell us which ones we should consider, or tell us which ones are important, is basically nonsense in my opinion. Most external stakeholders, especially those who are not experts are going to look at that list and either one, have no idea what you're asking, or two, say this looks like too much work, I'm not going to bother. So I agree with them that there is a massive challenge for stakeholders if you are just presenting them with this long list of things. The next statement, though, is where I start diverging from the opinion of this paper. It says the appropriate level must be identified for the discussions, with which I agree, but then it says at the level of the standards and at most the level of subtopics. Now here I completely disagree. In my opinion, the engagement with a stakeholder should be to help understand the impacts that impact them. That is, to understand how they are affected. And the most efficient, and certainly the clearest way to do this, is to have an idea of what the impact is and to take that specific impact to the affected stakeholder. I've seen this happen in practice, and it's something I recommend, that if you're able to properly construct an impact that is clear in its description and it's clear in its name, and that has enough information about the specifics of that impact so that a stakeholder would recognize it, there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking that description to the stakeholder in the first instance. And at that point, you work with the stakeholder in order to improve your understanding of it in terms of the assessment. So the stakeholder may be able to give you the information about the scale and the scope and the likelihood and the irremediability of an impact, for example. But it requires, I think in many cases, that you go to the stakeholder with a description of that impact in some way, or at least a description of the activities that are impacting them. So I don't think that restricting ourselves to the topic and the subtopic level is the intention of the standard. And I'm a bit nervous about telling people they must approach this at the standard or subtopic level and not the IRO level. Practice indicates to me that it can work, and there's certainly nothing in the standard that says you cannot go to the stakeholder with IROs. The standard does tell us that stakeholders can help us understand the severity, for example, of an impact. So I think it makes sense to go to the stakeholder with something that is fairly well described so you can get on with the process of getting their feedback to help you with the assessment. This last part here, proxies are therefore often used. That often would make more sense if you didn't have an IRO and you wanted to involve a proxy in the process of building IROs from scratch. But if you've not got that kind of relationship and you are looking to understand your IROs, then of course it makes sense to go with those IROs to the stakeholder. So I would be just a bit careful about interpreting a paper like this when it says things that are rather forceful of that nature, because I think practice is going beyond this, and there are certainly lots and lots of ways of practicing double materiality by engaging your stakeholders at the IRO level. So my last little quibble with this paper is the famous matrix. This still frustrates me every time I see something like this, and I'm going to show you why I find these kinds of visual representations problematic. Here we have financial materiality and impact materiality, and what we're trying to show is that the various IROs or the various matters will fall into one of four categories. An IRO can either be not material, it can be material for financial reasons, it can be material for impact reasons, or it can be material for both. That I'm comfortable with. I don't think it really needs to be visualized like this. There is actually a Venn diagram visualization in the IG1 paper, which is just more simple. And I would use that instead, because this is indicating on these axes that there is some kind of continuum here. Whereas the Venn diagram that EFRAG drafted that is in IG1 shows you there are three sets. Well, four sets, those that are outside the circles. This indicates that there's some kind of continuum. And I think this gets misleading. And then we see it reinforced. High financial opportunities, low financial opportunities, low positive, high and low. So these terms high and low are not in the standard. There is severity for impacts, and there is the magnitude and the likelihood for risks and opportunities. But low and high do not feature in the standard anywhere, and they don't feature in the guidance documents either. And then we have this concept in the top right hand corner here of very material. There is no such thing as very material. Under the standard, an IRO is either material or it is not. And it is material for financial reasons, impact reasons, or both. So I don't like the way this visualization has been put together, and I think it is misleading and taken to the extreme. If people rely on these kinds of diagrams for their understanding, rather than reading the standard, then I think you'll have a warped idea of what double materiality is all about. So I think this should be updated. To be honest, I think the easiest way to solve the problem here is just to use the Venn diagram that's in IG1, because that does the job better than this diagram does. So that comes to the conclusion of the review of this paper. I will provide the link to it. It's well worth a read. There are some sections which I obviously didn't cover in this video, including a large section at the end about internal control systems, and also a very interesting graph about the tools that people are using. Amazing to see how many people are using Excel for the entirety of double materiality. I really hope those Excel tools are compliant. Problem with Excel, one of the problems with Excel is every time someone builds a new Excel for double materiality, they are reinventing the process. And it is far better, in my opinion, to use a tool that has already been developed and approved, has passed audit, that does the job, rather than everybody coming up with their own spreadsheets all the time. But that's a conversation for another day, and I'm not the first to talk about that. Enjoy this paper if you've got it and you want to have a read, and we'll see you again on the channel.